Every day at exactly 5:20 p.m., the dog sat on the porch, waiting for a man the world had already given up on. The town said the war was over. The letters had stopped coming. But as winter buried the road in silence, she stayed right there, eyes fixed on the bend where his truck disappeared. The fog did not merely settle over Maple Hollow, it claimed it. It was a thick spectral tide that swallowed the jagged peaks of the Green Mountains and turned the towering pines into skeletal sentinels. On this particular Tuesday in November, the air carried a bite that tasted of iron and ancient snow. Every breath taken by Caleb Turner felt like swallowing shards of glass, a sharp reminder of the world's indifference to the departures of men. He stood by his battered blue pickup truck, the engine ticking as it cooled in the damp air. His hands, mapped with the scars of a decade spent in the shadows of the Hindu Kush, were steady, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Caleb tossed a heavy canvas duffel bag into the truck bed. The sound was a dull thud that seemed to be absorbed instantly by the mist. He didn't look back at the small saltbox house he had called home since his discharge. It was a place of ghosts and flickering memories, but today, the most painful presence was the one standing perfectly still by his side. Mara, a German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt embers and midnight, watched his every move. She didn't bark. She didn't wag her tail. She simply existed in his orbit, her amber eyes reflecting a wisdom that Caleb often found unsettling. She knew dogs like Mara didn't need words. They read the tension in a shoulder blade and the scent of impending distance. The gravel crunched under Caleb's boots as he walked toward the porch of a neighboring cottage a few hundred yards down the winding dirt road. This was the house of Margaret Vance, a widow whose face was a map of kindness and endurance. Standing beside her was Jimmy, a boy of 10 who carried his own brand of silence. Jimmy's father had never come back from a deployment 3 years prior, and the boy had retreated into a shell that only animals seemed able to crack. Caleb reached the porch, his shadow long and distorted in the gray light. He held Mara's leather leash in his hand, the weight of it feeling like a leaden chain. Margaret stepped forward, her hands tucked into the pockets of her wool cardigan. She didn't ask if he was sure. She knew the call of duty was a siren song that some men could never ignore, even after they had bled for it. Caleb looked at her, his expression a mask of stoic discipline. He told her the arrangements again, though they both knew them by heart. The food was in the shed. The vet's number was on the fridge. 1 year. He would be gone for 1 year working a private security and humanitarian contract in the frozen wilderness of the Alaskan interior. It was a chance to reset, to find a purpose that didn't involve a rifle. Yet it required him to leave behind the only creature that had kept him tethered to his humanity. Jimmy stepped toward Mara, his small hand trembling slightly as he reached out. Mara didn't flinch. She let the boy's fingers brush the soft fur behind her ears, but her gaze never wavered from Caleb. It was a haunting look, one of quiet accusation and profound devotion. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat, a physical obstruction he couldn't swallow away. He realized then that he wasn't just leaving a dog. He was surrendering his anchor. He had survived IEDs and ambushes, but the prospect of walking away from those amber eyes felt like the most dangerous mission he had ever undertaken. The wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of the porch, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Caleb knew it was time. The clock on his dashboard was ticking toward a departure he couldn't delay. He turned away from Margaret and Jimmy, sensing their sympathy like a heat source he didn't deserve. He walked back toward the truck, Mara following closely, her paws silent on the frosted grass. Beside the driver's side door, Caleb stopped. He didn't get in. Instead, he turned to face the dog, the silence between them becoming a living, breathing thing. Caleb slowly sank to one knee on the frozen ground. The dampness seeped into his jeans, but he didn't feel the cold. He reached out his large, calloused hands framing Mara's head. He pulled her gently toward him until their foreheads touched. This was their ritual, a silent communion they had shared in the dark hours of the night when the nightmares of war came calling. Caleb closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her rain, earth, and loyalty. He whispered a promise into the space between them, a vow that he would return, that this wasn't the end, but merely a long winter. Mara let out a low guttural whimper. It wasn't a cry of pain, but a sound of deep, soulful mourning. She leaned her weight into him, her body a warm furnace against his chest. In that moment, the world of Maple Hollow ceased to exist. There was no fog, no mission in Alaska, no grieving widow or lonely boy. There was only the heartbeat of a man and the soul of a dog intertwined by a bond that transcended the physical world. Caleb's grip tightened for a fraction of a second, his knuckles white before he forced himself to pull away. He stood up abruptly, the movement harsh and clinical. He handed the leash to Margaret, who had walked down from the porch to meet them. He didn't look at her face. He couldn't. He simply nodded a brief jerky motion and climbed into the cab of his truck. The engine roared to life, a violent intrusion into the morning stillness. He shifted into gear, his hand trembling on the shifter. As he began to roll forward, he looked into the side mirror. Mara was standing exactly where he had left her, her posture rigid, her head cocked to the side as if waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. The truck gathered speed, the tires humming on the asphalt of the main road. Caleb watched the figures in the mirror grow smaller, blurred by the encroaching fog. Margaret had her hand on Jimmy's shoulder, and the boy was reaching down to touch Mara. But the dog remained motionless. She was a statue of grief, a sentinel left behind in the frost. As Caleb rounded the first sharp bend that would take him out of the valley, he saw her one last time, a dark silhouette against the white veil of the mist, watching the space where he had been. The silence inside the cab was deafening. The passenger seat, usually occupied by a panting, happy Mara, was empty and cold. Caleb gripped the steering wheel so hard his hands ached. He told himself it was only year. He told himself she was in good hands. But as the town of Maple Hollow disappeared into the gray abyss behind him, a heavy, hollow sensation settled in his gut. He was a man who had been trained to survive anything. But as he drove toward the frozen north, he realized he had left his heart standing on a foggy porch in Vermont, and the road ahead felt longer than any distance he had ever traveled. Behind him on the porch, Mara did not move. She didn't look at the treats Jimmy offered or the warm bed Margaret had prepared. She kept her eyes fixed on the bend in the road, her ears pricked, listening for the fading echo of an engine that was carrying her world away. The fog thickened, wrapping around her like a cold shroud, but she remained a silent, golden-eyed guardian of a promise, waiting for the return of the man who had vanished into the white. The calendar pages turned with a heavy, rhythmic finality, each day marked by the deepening blue of the Vermont winter. The vibrant golds and crimsons of autumn had long since been buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. Inside Margaret's farmhouse, the air was a thick tapestry of scents, dried sage wood smoke, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of baking bread. The hearth crackled incessantly, throwing orange light across the worn floorboards, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the stoic grief of the creature who occupied the porch. Mara had become a ghost of her former self. She was no longer the bounding, exuberant companion Caleb had raised. Instead, she had become a creature of habit, a living monument to a promise. Every afternoon, as the shadows of the skeletal maples stretched long and thin across the driveway, Mara would rise from her spot by the door. She would push through the heavy oak entrance and take her position on the porch, ignoring the biting wind that whipped through the valley. It was the ritual of 5:20. It was the hour Caleb used to return from the local timber mill, his boots clomping on the wood, his voice a low rumble that signaled the start of their evening. Now at exactly 5:20, the only sound was the whistling wind and the occasional groan of the house settling in the cold. Mara would sit her ears, pricked her golden eyes scanning the bend in the road where the truck had last disappeared. She remained there until the sun dipped below the horizon and the world turned to ink, her body shivering, but her spirit unyielding. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her heart aching for the animal. She tried everything: bowls of warm beef broth, soft blankets, even the old radio playing soft jazz to mask the silence. But Mara was indifferent to comfort. The old woman noticed, however, that the dog was changing in ways that went beyond grief. Mara's gait had become heavy, her belly beginning to swell beneath her thick coat. One evening, while rubbing the dog's ears to coax her inside, Margaret's hand brushed against the firm, rounded underside of Mara's torso. She felt a faint, rhythmic thrum, the unmistakable kick of new life. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. Caleb hadn't known. In the chaos of his deployment and the rush of his departure, the secret had remained hidden. Mara was carrying Caleb's legacy, a flicker of hope in the midst of a cold, uncertain winter. Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she realized the weight of the responsibility now resting on her aging shoulders. She began to prepare moving sacks of grain and old quilts into the large walk-in pantry, the warmest, most insulated room in the house, located right behind the kitchen stove. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, a monstrous nor'easter that turned the world into a howling void of white. The wind screamed through the eaves, and the old farmhouse shuddered under the pressure. Inside, the power flickered and then died, leaving the house bathed in the flickering glow of candlelight and the dying embers of the fire. Mara became restless, her usual stoicism replaced by a frantic pacing. She whined low in her throat, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Margaret knew the time had come. With a flashlight tucked under her arm, she guided the laboring dog into the pantry. The space was cramped but cozy, smelling of cedar and stored apples. Margaret knelt on the floor, her old joints protesting, but her hands were steady. She had been a surgical nurse for 30 years, before retiring to this quiet life, and the muscle memory of crisis response returned to her with startling clarity. The labor was long and grueling. Outside, the blizzard battered the walls, but inside the pantry the air was thick with the scent of life and salt. Mara's eyes were wide, seeking Margaret's gaze for reassurance. The old woman spoke in a low rhythmic hum, a soft lullaby of words that kept the panic at bay. Around midnight, the first pup arrived, a tiny, squirming bundle of wet fur. Margaret worked quickly, clearing the airway and rubbing the small body until a faint, high-pitched squeak pierced the air. An hour later, the second pup followed. Mara, exhausted but driven by an ancient primal instinct, began to lick them clean. The first, a female with a white patch on her chest, was a firebrand of energy, already searching for her mother's milk. Margaret named her Hazel. The second, a male with broad paws and a calm demeanor even in his first minutes of life, was named Bruno. They were the living bridge to a man thousands of miles away, fighting a war in a land of sand and heat, oblivious to the miracles occurring in his grandmother's pantry. As the dawn began to break, the storm finally exhausted itself. A pale, weak sun rose over a world buried in 6 feet of snow, casting long blue shadows across the drifts. Margaret sat on the floor of the pantry, her back against a shelf of preserves, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Mara's chest. The dog was spent, her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed in a daze of maternal exhaustion. Hazel and Bruno were tucked tight against her warmth, their tiny heartbeats, a frantic, beautiful counterpoint to the silence of the house. Despite the miracle she had just witnessed, Margaret noticed Mara's gaze. Even in her state of total depletion, the dog's eyes were fixed on the small, frost-covered window of the pantry. The window looked out toward the road that was now completely erased by the snow. Mara let out a long, shuddering sigh, her tail giving a single weak thump against the floor. She had brought new life into the world, but her vigil was far from over. The puppies were a comfort, but they were not the man she was waiting for. Margaret reached out and stroked Mara's head, her fingers tracing the velvet of her ears. She knew the months ahead would be hard. The isolation of the winter had only just begun, and the news from the front lines was sparse and often grim. But as she looked at the two small souls nursing blindly in the dark, she felt a flicker of the same stubborn hope that kept Mara on the porch at 5:20 every evening. They would survive, they would wait, and when the snow finally melted, they would be there to greet the return of the master of the house. Mara closed her eyes, drifting into a shallow sleep, but her ears remained pricked, twitching at the sound of the wind. In her dreams, she was still standing on that porch. The fog was lifting, and the distant rumble of a truck was finally, mercifully drawing closer to home. The miracle in the pantry was a beginning, but for Mara, the story would only truly end when the circle was closed and the pack was whole once more. The winter of 1944 refused to surrender its grip on the Alaskan wilderness, wrapping the landscape in a suffocating shroud of white that seemed to erase the very boundaries between the earth and the sky. Inside the small wooden house, the air smelled of dried cedar wood smoke and the warm, musky scent of growing animals. Hazel and Bruno were no longer the tiny blind creatures that had huddled against Mara in the dark of the pantry. They had transformed into bundles of chaotic energy, their paws oversized for their bodies, their coats thickening into the dense weather-resistant fur of true northern sled dogs. Hazel, the smaller of the two, possessed a sharp intelligence in her amber eyes, often tilting her head as if deciphering the human conversations around her. Bruno was a force of nature, a clumsy, broad-chested pup who tumbled over his own feet but possessed a heart as steady as an anchor. Jimmy had found a new reason to wake up in the mornings. The silence that had once haunted the house, the heavy void left by his father's departure, was now filled with the rhythmic scratching of claws on floorboards and the soft whines of puppies begging for attention. He took his responsibilities seriously, measuring out the precious scraps of dried fish and kibble with the precision of a chemist. He spent hours grooming them, his small hands moving through their fur, learning every muscle and bone. In the presence of the dogs, Jimmy's stutter vanished, and the hunched posture he carried at school straightened. He was their guardian, their leader, and in their uncritical eyes he saw the person he desperately wanted to become. Margaret watched her son from the kitchen, her hands often paused over a bowl of dough or a pile of mending. She saw the way Jimmy whispered secrets into Hazel's ears, and the way Mara watched over the entire process with a regal, tired grace. Mara had recovered her strength, but she remained a shadow of her former self, her soul still tethered to the 520 ritual. Every evening, regardless of the blizzard outside, she would pull herself away from her pups and take her station by the door. She was the silent matriarch of hope, a living reminder that someone was missing. The routine of their isolation was broken only by the arrival of Arnold, the local postman. He was a man of few words, his face etched with the harsh lines of a lifetime spent fighting the elements. Usually, the sound of his snow-choked truck was a herald of joy, bringing crinkled envelopes postmarked from distant military bases. But as the weeks bled into a month, the letters from Caleb stopped. One Tuesday afternoon, Arnold climbed the porch steps, his heavy boots thudding with a sound that felt like a funeral knell. He didn't reach for his leather satchel. Instead, he pulled his collar up against the biting wind and looked at Margaret with eyes that carried the weight of 1,000 miles of bad news. "The weather has turned into a beast," Margaret Arnold said, his voice muffled by his scarf. "The mountain passes are choked, the supply planes can't get through to the coast, and the mail ships are iced in at the harbor. Everything from the Aleutians is at a standstill. It's not just your Caleb. No one is getting word." He looked down at his boots, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry. I'll keep checking the depot, but until this front breaks, we're cut off from the world." Margaret nodded slowly, her hand gripping the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. She thanked him, her voice a fragile reed in the wind, and watched him disappear back into the white void. The house felt colder that evening. The fire in the hearth seemed to provide light, but no heat. The missing letters were more than just paper. They were the oxygen that kept their hope alive. Without them, the possibility of Caleb never returning began to harden into a terrifying reality. Jimmy saw the change in his mother, the way her eyes lingered on the empty mantelpiece, the way she forgot to finish her tea. That night, Jimmy retreated to the corner of the living room where the dogs slept. He sat on the floor, pulling Bruno into his lap, while Hazel rested her chin on his knee. Mara sat nearby, her ears twitching at the howling wind that rattled the window panes. Jimmy began to speak, his voice a low murmur that barely rose above the crackle of the fire. He talked about the boys at school, who called him Little Bird, because he was small and quiet. He talked about the fear that sat in his stomach like a cold stone every time the teacher asked him to read aloud. "I'm scared, Mara," Jimmy whispered, his fingers buried in Bruno's thick neck fur. "I'm scared that Dad won't remember me, and I'm scared that if he does come back, he'll see that I'm still just a coward." He wiped a stray tear with the back of his hand. "You're so brave. You wait every day. You don't care if the snow is 10 feet deep. You just believe he's coming. I want to believe like you do. I want to be the man he told me to be." Mara shifted, leaning her weight against the boy's side. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the vibration of his grief and the scent of his anxiety. She let out a low, rumbling huff and licked his cheek, her tongue rough and warm. In that moment, Jimmy realized that his father hadn't just left him with a dog. He had left him with a mirror. Mara's unwavering loyalty was a challenge to his own spirit. If she could face the horizon every day without a single doubt, then he could face the walk to school. He could face the silence. The days continued to pass in a blur of gray and white. The lack of mail created a vacuum of anxiety that threatened to pull the family apart. Margaret grew thinner, her movements becoming mechanical. She stopped singing while she worked. The puppies, sensing the tension, became more subdued, trailing after Margaret like silent sentinels. The house was a fortress, but it was also a prison of what-ifs. Every time the wind shrieked, it sounded like a cry for help. Every time a branch snapped under the weight of ice, it sounded like a gunshot. One late afternoon, as the sun began its rapid descent toward the jagged peaks of the horizon, the atmosphere changed. The wind hadn't died down and the temperature remained well below zero, but a strange electricity seemed to ripple through the air. Mara, who had been resting near the stove, suddenly stood up. Her movement was fluid and urgent. She didn't walk to the door. She bounded to it, her claws clicking sharply on the wood. Her tail was held high, and her ears were pinned forward, focused on something far beyond the wooden walls. Jimmy and Margaret both froze. It wasn't 5:20 yet. It was barely 4 o'clock. Mara began to pace, a low melodic whine vibrating in her throat. She looked back at them, her eyes wide and glowing with an intensity they hadn't seen in months. She scratched at the door, not with her usual patient request, but with a frantic, desperate need to be outside. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was reacting to something that only her heightened senses could perceive, a shift in the world, a distant heartbeat, or perhaps a messenger of a different kind. A flickering beacon of hope meets the cold reality of a cruel coincidence, shattering the fragile peace of a family waiting for a miracle that refuses to arrive. The sun began its slow, agonizing descent toward the jagged teeth of the horizon, bleeding a deep, bruised crimson across the Siberian sky. It was that deceptive hour of the afternoon, where the world seemed to be made of liquid gold and fire, yet the air remained a razor-sharp blade that cut through the thickest wool. The vast expanse of the tundra was no longer just white. It was a kaleidoscope of violet shadows and amber highlights, the snow crusting over into a brittle, glass-like layer that crunched under the slightest pressure. Inside the small, weathered house, the silence was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the shoulders of those within. Mara was not inside. She stood at the very edge of the perimeter fence, her paws sinking slightly into the crystalline powder. Her body was a study in absolute stillness, a golden statue carved against the backdrop of an infinite winter. Every fiber of her being was tuned to the horizon. Her ears, those sensitive radars of loyalty, twitched at the slightest sigh of the wind or the distant crack of a frozen branch. For days she had been a sentinel of expectation, her internal clock synchronized with a homecoming that was now months overdue. Suddenly, a sound fractured the stillness. It was not the rhythmic howling of the gale or the groan of the shifting ice. It was a low mechanical thrum, a vibration that traveled through the frozen earth before it reached the ear. Mara's entire posture changed in a heartbeat. Her tail, which had been hanging low, suddenly swept upward, fanning the air with frantic energy. A sharp, melodic yelp escaped her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that she had suppressed for far too long. She began to dance on her front paws, her nails clicking against the ice like a frantic telegraph. Down the long, winding ribbon of the dirt track that served as the only artery to the outside world, a dark shape appeared. It was a silhouette at first, a smudge of charcoal against the dying fire of the sunset. It moved slowly, navigating the treacherous ruts and frozen puddles with a cautious, deliberate pace. As it drew closer, the glint of sunlight bounced off a metallic surface. It was a large, dark SUV, its tires churning through the slush, sending sprays of gray mud against its blackened fenders. Jimmy, hearing Mara's frantic barking, scrambled to the frost-coated window, his breath hitching in his chest. He wiped a circular patch on the glass with his palm, his eyes widening as he saw the vehicle. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. She didn't say a word, but the sudden pallor of her face spoke volumes. They stood together, paralyzed by a hope so intense it felt like physical pain. Could it be? Had the silence finally been broken? The vehicle continued its slow approach, the engine growling louder as it fought the incline toward their gate. Mara was now a whirlwind of motion. She threw herself against the wooden slats of the gate, her tail beating a frantic rhythm against the posts. She let out a series of high-pitched, welcoming barks, her body wriggling with an ecstasy that seemed to defy the freezing temperatures. To her, that metal beast was not a machine. It was the shell that contained her master, the man whose scent she had memorized, and whose return she had prophesied every single day. The SUV slowed down as it neared the entrance to their property. The brakes squealed, a long, drawn-out metallic cry that echoed across the empty plains. The headlights, already flicked on against the encroaching gloom, cut 2 yellow tunnels through the rising mist. It crawled to a near halt, right in front of the gate, where Mara stood. The dog was nearly turning circles now, her whimpers of excitement turning into a frantic, pleading song. She pressed her nose against the gap in the wood, her eyes fixed on the tinted glass of the driver's side window, waiting for it to roll down, waiting for the familiar hand to reach out and ruffle her ears. Inside the house, Margaret's hand found Jimmy's shoulder, her grip tightening until it hurt. They held their breath, the world outside seemingly suspended in a vacuum of anticipation. The wind seemed to die down, the birds went silent, and even the shadows stopped their crawl. For 10 agonizing seconds, the vehicle sat there, idling its exhaust, forming a thick white cloud that swirled around Mara like a ghostly shroud. Then the moment shattered. The driver's side window did not roll down. The door did not creak open. Instead, the front tires turned sharply away from the gate. The engine roared with a sudden, aggressive surge of power, and the SUV accelerated. It didn't turn into the driveway. It swung wide, performing a clumsy U-turn in the middle of the road. As the vehicle pivoted, the fading light hit the driver's face for a fleeting second. A stranger, a man with a map spread across his lap, and a look of frustrated confusion on his features. He had simply been lost, a traveler who had taken a wrong turn into the middle of nowhere. The SUV sped away, its red taillights shrinking into 2 tiny mocking embers in the distance. The sound of the engine faded, replaced by the returning mournful whistle of the wind. The silence that followed was louder than the roar of the car had ever been. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that tasted of salt and iron. Mara didn't move at first. She remained standing at the gate, her front paws still resting on the middle rail. Her tail, which had been a blur of motion seconds ago, slowed to a stop and then dropped hanging limp and lifeless. Her head tilted to the side, her ears drooping as she watched the red lights disappear over the rise. She stayed like that for a long time, a creature caught in the transition between a dream and a nightmare. The realization didn't come all at once. It seeped into her a slow, freezing tide that extinguished the fire in her eyes. Finally, her strength seemed to fail her. Mara's legs buckled slightly, and she slumped down into the snow. She didn't lie down with her usual grace. She collapsed, her chin resting on the frozen ground, her gaze still fixed on the empty road where the miracle had almost happened. A low, broken whine vibrated in her chest, not a call for help but a lament for a lost certainty. The trust that had been her armor for months showed its first visible crack. The back door of the house creaked open, complaining on its frozen hinges. Margaret stepped out into the biting cold, her coat thrown loosely over her shoulders. She didn't call out to the dog. She walked slowly across the yard, her boots sinking deep into the drifts. When she reached the gate, she knelt in the snow beside Mara, ignoring the chill that seeped into her knees. She reached out a trembling hand and buried her fingers in the dog's thick, golden neck fur. Mara didn't look up. She simply leaned her weight against Margaret's leg, seeking a different kind of warmth. The woman pulled the dog close, her own tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. She pressed her forehead against the dog's velvet ears, her voice a fragile whisper that was almost lost to the wind. "Hope is a heavy burden, Mara," Margaret murmured, her voice thick with a grief she could no longer hide. "It's a weight that breaks your back while it keeps you standing. But it's the only thing that keeps us alive in this God-forsaken white hell. We have to carry it, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." They sat there together as the last sliver of the sun vanished, leaving the world to the mercy of the stars and the biting, indifferent cold. The house behind them was a lonely island of light in a sea of darkness, and the road ahead remained a path to nowhere, a ribbon of ice waiting for a traveler who might never come. The morning in Maple Hollow arrived not with a sunrise, but with a thickening of the gray veil that had draped the valley for weeks. The air was a physical weight, brittle and tasting of iron. Inside the house, the silence was so absolute that the hum of the old refrigerator sounded like a rhythmic threnody. Mara remained in her self-appointed sanctuary by the front door, her body a coiled spring of fading hope. Every creak of the floorboards or groan of the timber frame sent a ripple through her muscles, but her eyes, once vibrant and searching, had begun to film over with a glazed, distant sorrow. The distant rumble of a heavy engine fractured the stillness. It was a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to the wind. Mara's ears flicked forward, then stood sharp. She scrambled to her feet, her claws clicking frantically against the hardwood. This was different from the occasional wind-whipped branch. The sound grew louder, the crunch of heavy tires over the frozen gravel of the driveway vibrating through the floor. A surge of adrenaline, perhaps the last of its kind, propelled her toward the window. A flash of yellow appeared through the mist. It wasn't the rugged, mud-caked truck Caleb drove, but Mara didn't care about the color. She only knew the geometry of a vehicle and the promise it carried. A door slammed shut, a sharp metallic crack that echoed across the yard like a gunshot. Mara let out a frantic, high-pitched yelp, her tail thumping against the wall with a hollow rhythm. She spun in circles, her paws sliding on the rug, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was home. The long winter was over. Margaret hurried into the hallway, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. For a split second, she allowed herself to share the dog's delusion. She reached for the door handle, her breath hitching in her throat. But as she pulled the heavy oak door open, the reality that stood on the porch was a cold dousing of ice water. It wasn't Caleb. It was a man in a thick, grease-stained parka with a clipboard tucked under his arm and a hard hat reflecting the dull sky. The man, a local technician named Caldwell, didn't look up from his notes. He was just a man doing a job oblivious to the fact that his arrival had just shattered the fragile remains of a family's heart. He muttered something about checking the external meters in the transformer before the storm hit. Mara, who had been trying to squeeze past Margaret's legs to reach the visitor, suddenly stopped. She sniffed the air, her nose twitching. The scent was wrong. It was oil, stale, coffee, and the smell of a stranger. It wasn't the scent of pine needles, gunpowder, and the warm, familiar musk of the man she had waited for since the first frost. The light in Mara's eyes didn't just dim. It vanished. She didn't bark at the stranger. She didn't growl. She simply backed away, her head dropping until her nose nearly touched the floor. The frantic energy that had sustained her for hours collapsed into a profound, heavy lethargy. As Caldwell turned to walk toward the side of the house, his boots crunching loudly in the snow, Mara retreated to the living room. She didn't return to the window. Instead, she crawled under the heavy oak dining table, a place she usually avoided, and curled into a tight, shivering ball. Margaret watched the dog, her own grief mirrored in those slumped shoulders. She tried to call her, her voice cracking as she offered a piece of dried meat, a treat Mara usually couldn't resist. The dog didn't even twitch an ear. The bowl of expensive kibble Margaret had placed in the corner remained untouched, the surface of the water in the ceramic dish gathering a thin skin of dust. The house felt colder now, as if the radiator had finally given up, though the pipes still rattled with heat. Jimmy watched from the shadows of the hallway. He was only 10, but the wisdom of a child who has lived through a long winter of waiting made him look older. He saw his mother kneeling by the table, whispering pleas to a dog that had decided to stop living. He saw the way Mara's ribs were beginning to trace sharp lines beneath her golden coat. To Jimmy, Mara wasn't just a pet. She was the last living link to his father. If Mara gave up, it meant the connection was severed. It meant the ghost of Caleb was finally fading into the Alaskan wilderness. The afternoon bled into a bruised purple twilight. The wind began to pick up a low moan that seeped through the window seals. Inside, the tension finally snapped. Jimmy walked into the kitchen, his face pale and his eyes rimmed with red. He didn't look at the food on the table. He looked at Margaret, who was staring blankly at the wall, a tea bag steeping in a cup of cold water. "Mom, is he ever coming back?" Jimmy's voice was small, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. She searched for the lies she usually told him, the ones about the military bureaucracy, and the difficulty of communication in the Northern Territories. But the words felt like ash in her mouth. Jimmy stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. Mara knows, doesn't she? That's why she won't eat. She knows he's gone. She knows he's like those men in the stories he told me. The ones who got lost in the whiteout and turned into statues of ice. He's gone, Mom. He's out there in the snow, and he's never coming home. The boy broke, then a jagged sob tearing from his chest. He collapsed into his mother's lap, his small frame shaking with the force of months of repressed terror. Margaret held him her own tears, finally falling hot and silent onto his hair. They sat there on the kitchen floor, two souls adrift in a sea of uncertainty, while the dog remained motionless under the table, a silent witness to their shared collapse. Jimmy's cries were the only sound in the house, a raw, primal mourning for a man who was neither dead nor alive, but caught in the purgatory of the missing. As the night deepened, the predicted storm finally arrived. It didn't start with a flurry. It started with a roar. The wind hit the house with the force of a physical blow, making the old timbers groan in protest. The temperature plummeted, and the snow began to fall in sheets so thick they were opaque. This was the legendary blizzard the old-timers in town had warned about, the kind of storm that redefined the landscape and buried entire histories under a white shroud. Margaret stood by the window, watching as the world outside disappeared. The gate where Mara had spent so many hours was gone, swallowed by a drift. The road, the path that held all their hopes, was being erased inch by inch. Within an hour there was no road, no fence, no horizon. There was only a swirling, chaotic whiteness that felt like the end of the world. She looked back at Mara. The dog hadn't moved. The blizzard outside was a reflection of the cold that had finally settled in the animal's heart. The road was gone. The trail was buried. And as the house shook under the fury of the gale, a terrifying thought took root in Margaret's mind. If Caleb was still out there, if he was trying to find his way back to them tonight, he wouldn't just be lost. He would be erased. The great blizzard had finally spent its fury, leaving behind a world transformed into a silent, crystalline kingdom. The sky, which had been a chaotic swirl of gray and white for was now a deep velvet indigo, pierced by the cold brilliance of a billion stars. There was no wind, no rustle of trees, no distant hum of machinery. The silence was so absolute, it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the small house, buried deep in the drifts. Inside, the embers in the fireplace cast a dying orange glow across the living room, painting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried pine, and the faint, sweet scent of warm milk from where the puppies huddled together in their basket. Mara lay near the hearth, her large body curled into a protective crescent around her young. For days she had been a statue of grief, her spirit seemingly extinguished along with the hope of the family. Her breathing was shallow, rhythmic, and heavy, with the exhaustion of a soul that had waited too long for a miracle. The puppies were a soft, undulating mass of fur, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison, oblivious to the drama of the world outside. The house was a sanctuary of stillness, a pocket of warmth in an ocean of ice. Suddenly, Mara's ears flicked. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny twitch of muscle that defied the deep slumber she appeared to be in. Her eyes snapped open, not with the clouded lethargy of sleep, but with a sharp, piercing intensity. She did not move her body, but her head lifted slowly, her nostrils widening as she drew in a deep, lung-filling breath of the stagnant indoor air. At first, there was only the smell of the house, dust, old wood, and Margaret's lingering floral perfume. But then a draft of cold air snaked through a microscopic crack in the doorframe, carrying with it the secrets of the night. Mara stood up. The movement was fluid and silent, startling the puppies who tumbled over each other with soft grunts of protest. She ignored them. She walked toward the door, her paws making no sound on the wooden floor. She pressed her nose against the base of the door, inhaling so sharply that her ribs expanded visibly. Her tail, which had been motionless for weeks, gave a single tentative wag. She wasn't just smelling the snow. She was filtering the atmosphere, searching for a ghost. The scent hit her like a physical blow. It was faint, nearly drowned out by the sterile crispness of the frozen world, but to Mara it was a roar of information. Underneath the biting cold of the mountain air, there was the unmistakable tang of sea salt, a sharp metallic edge of aviation fuel, and a deep earthy musk of unwashed wool and human sweat. It was the scent of a man who had traveled across oceans and through fire, a scent that was etched into the very DNA of her memory. It was the smell of the hand that had rubbed her ears since she was a pup, the smell of the boots that had walked beside her through 1,000 forests. It was Caleb. Mara began to tremble. It wasn't the shiver of cold, but a violent rhythmic vibration of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She let out a sound that was neither a bark nor a howl, a low melodic whine that vibrated in her throat, a sound of agonizing joy. She began to pace in front of the door, her claws finally clicking against the floorboards, a frantic percussion that echoed through the silent house. She looked back toward the hallway where Margaret and Jimmy slept, then back at the door, her body torn between the urge to alert her pack and the instinct to burst through the wood. Then came the sound. It was distant, muffled by the thick blankets of snow, but it was rhythmic. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of heavy boots breaking through the frozen crust of the drifts. It was a slow pace, heavy and burdened, as if each step required a monumental effort of will. Mara froze, her head tilted to the side, her ears swiveling to track the noise. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the main road, moving past the buried fence, heading straight for the porch. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Crunch, scrape, crunch. Whoever it was, they were stumbling, their rhythm uneven, but they were not stopping. Mara began to scratch at the door, her movements becoming more frantic. She let out a sharp, short yelp, a signal, a cry of recognition that pierced the silence of the house. Upstairs, a bed creaked. A floorboard groaned. The house was waking up, but the world outside was still caught in the grip of the moonlight. The footsteps reached the porch stairs. One step, a long pause. A heavy thud as if a shoulder had leaned against the railing for support. Another step. The wood of the porch groaned under the weight, a familiar protest that Mara knew by heart. She was now standing on her hind legs, her front paws batting at the door handle, her whining turning into a series of frantic, muffled barks. She could hear the person's breathing now, ragged, wet, and exhausted, a desperate gasping for air in the freezing night. A hand fumbled with the exterior latch. The sound of metal on metal was like a lightning bolt in the room. The gate to the small garden outside the porch, Keoket, creaked open on its frozen hinges. Mara dropped to all fours, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on the door handle. The silence of the night was shattered by the simple, mundane sound of a man coming home. The door didn't open immediately. There was a long, agonizing moment where nothing happened. Mara stopped barking. She stood perfectly still, her nose inches from the wood, her tail frozen in midair. She could hear the person on the other side resting their forehead against the door. A soft, broken sob drifted through the wood, a human sound raw and filled with a relief that was too heavy to carry. Slowly, the latch turned. The door swung inward, pushed by the weight of the man leaning against it. A gust of icy air swirled into the warm living room, carrying a cloud of powdery snow that danced in the orange light of the embers. And there, framed by the yellow glow of the porch light and the silver brilliance of the stars, stood a tall, hulking figure. He was wrapped in a coat that was torn and stained, his face half hidden by a thick, frost-covered beard and a hood. But his eyes, red-rimmed and brimming with tears, found Mara's immediately. Story. The silence that followed the opening of the door was not empty. It was heavy, thick, with the weight of 1,000 days spent in the freezing dark and 1,000 nights spent dreaming of this very threshold. Caleb Turner stood in the frame of the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the pristine white of the falling snow behind him. He looked like a ghost that had finally found its way back to the world of the living. His frame, once broad and powerful, was now lean to the point of frailty, his clothes hanging off him in tattered layers. His beard was a wild thicket of salt and pepper, matted with ice, and his hair fell in greasy tangles over his brow. But it was his eyes that held the story of his journey, sunken, dark-rimmed, yet burning with a fierce, desperate light, as they landed on the golden dog standing in the center of the room. Mara did not move. Her chest was frozen mid-breath, her ears pricked so high they trembled. The scent hitting her was a chaotic symphony of things she remembered and things she didn't. There was the smell of the old leather jacket he used to wear, the faint metallic tang of the rifle oil he once used, and the deep, earthy musk of the man himself. But layered over it was the stench of wood smoke, the bitter salt of the sea, and the cold, sterile scent of distant hospitals. She stared at him, her body vibrating with a tension so high it seemed she might shatter like glass. Caleb's gaze shifted, then moving from Mara's face to the space behind her. His breath hitched in his throat, a ragged sound that caught on the frost in his lungs. There, peeping out from behind Mara's sturdy legs, were two small furry heads. Hazel and Bruno, the puppies who had never known a world with Caleb Turner in it, were huddled together. Their eyes were wide, their tails tucked tightly between their legs. They didn't know this man. To them he was a giant, a shadow from the storm, smelling of things that were wild and dangerous. They let out small, uncertain whimpers, pressing their warm bodies against Mara's flanks for protection. A flicker of pure, unadulterated pain crossed Caleb's face. He stayed rooted to the spot, his hands trembling at his sides. In his mind, the year he had been gone felt like a century. He saw the puppies, and a terrifying thought took hold of his heart tighter than the cold of the mountain passes. He thought he had been replaced. He thought that in the time the world had believed him dead, Mara had found a new life, a new family, and that the memory of the man who had raised her had faded into nothing more than a ghost of a scent. He felt like an intruder in his own home, a man who had returned from the grave only to find that the living had no more room for him. He didn't dare step forward. He didn't dare speak. He simply leaned his head against the doorframe, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his exhaustion and his sudden crushing doubt. The wind howled behind him, throwing a spray of snow across the wooden floorboards, but he didn't feel the cold. He only felt the distance between himself and the dog who had been his entire world. Mara felt the shift in the air. She saw the way his spirit seemed to wilt, the way his eyes lost that spark of hope. The instinct that had kept her waiting by the window for 365 days surged through her veins like fire. She took a step forward, her paws silent on the rug. Then another. She ignored the confused whines of the puppies behind her. She walked toward the man in the doorway, her nose twitching, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When she reached the edge of the porch, where the warmth of the house met the bite of the winter night, she stopped. Caleb looked down at her, his vision blurred by tears that finally began to spill over, carving clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He slowly, painfully lowered himself to his knees. The movement was stiff, his joints protesting every inch of the descent until he was eye level with her in the snow. He didn't reach out. He didn't want to force her. He simply opened his arms wide, a silent invitation, a plea for recognition. Mara didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, not with a bark or a playful jump, but with a force that nearly knocked him backward into the snow. She buried her head in the crook of his neck, her entire body shaking with a violent, rhythmic sobbing motion that dogs only make when their hearts are overflowing. And then she lifted her head toward the black, star-studded sky and let out a howl. It was a long, mournful, and triumphant sound that tore through the silence of the valley. It was the sound of a year of waiting, of every cold night spent alone, of every prayer Margaret had whispered, and of a loyalty that had refused to die even when hope seemed gone. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her thick golden fur. He breathed in the scent of her, the scent of home, of sunshine, and of the life he had fought so hard to return to. He sobbed into her neck, his fingers clutching her coat, as if he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. The two of them stayed there, locked in that embrace, while the snow began to settle on their backs, turning them into a single white-dusted statue of reunion. Behind them, the two puppies watched with growing curiosity. The fear that had kept them pinned to the rug began to dissolve, replaced by a strange magnetic pull. They didn't understand the history of the man in the snow, but they understood the emotion radiating from Mara. They had heard Margaret talk about Caleb in hushed, sad tones every night before the fire. They had seen the way Mara would stare at his old boots. Slowly, Hazel took the first step. She crawled forward on her belly, her tail giving a tiny, uncertain wag. Bruno followed his sister, his nose working overtime. As they reached the threshold, they caught the scent of the man for the first time. It wasn't the scent of a stranger. It was a scent that was woven into the very fabric of the house they lived in. It was the smell of the old photographs on the mantel, the smell of the blankets in the attic, the smell of the man who belonged here. They reached Caleb's boots, sniffing the worn leather, and then moved to his hands, which were still buried in Mara's fur. Caleb felt the small, wet noses against his skin. He pulled back slightly from Mara, his eyes widening as he looked down at the two tiny lives he hadn't known existed. A weak, trembling smile broke through his beard. He reached out one hand palm up and let the puppies investigate him. Hazel was the first to lunge, her tongue darting out to lick the salt from his palm, her tail now whipping back and forth in a frantic blur of joy. Bruno followed suit, climbing onto Caleb's lap and yapping with a high-pitched, excited tone that broke the last of the tension. The distance was gone. The fear of being forgotten evaporated in the heat of the puppies' tongues and the steady grounding weight of Mara against his chest. Caleb Turner was no longer a ghost or a stranger. He was the center of a pack that had grown in his absence, a father to two new lives, and a hero to the one who had never given up on him. As the lights in the upstairs windows flickered on and the sound of Margaret's hurried footsteps echoed on the stairs, Caleb realized he wasn't just coming back to his old life. He was coming home to a new one built on the foundation of a love that had survived the impossible. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with the electricity of 1,000 unspoken prayers. Margaret's hands, weathered by years of hard work and the quiet burden of waiting, flew to her mouth to stifle a cry. A strangled sob escaped her lips, a sound that was half prayer and half shriek. She did not move at first. She simply stared at the man kneeling in the snow, his arms wrapped around the dog she had cared for, as if it were her own child. Caleb looked up the moonlight, catching the tears that now carved tracks through the grime and weariness on his face. He looked older, his features sharpened by whatever trials he had endured, but the eyes were unmistakably his. They were the eyes that Margaret had seen in every dream, the eyes that had looked back at her from the fading photographs on the mantel for years. Jimmy was the first to break the paralysis. With a cry that sounded like a dam bursting, he lunged forward, his boots thudding against the wooden porch. He did not care about the cold or the strangeness of the man's appearance. He only knew that the hero from his mother's stories, the man whose return he had imagined every single day, was finally there. He collided with Caleb, throwing his small arms around the man's neck with a force that nearly knocked them both over. Caleb caught him, his large hands trembling as they gripped the boy's coat. The sensation of a child's embrace, so soft and full of life, was almost too much to bear after so much time in the cold. He buried his face in Jimmy's shoulder, the scent of laundry detergent and wood smoke filling his senses. For the first time in years, the tension that had held his spine like a steel rod began to snap. Margaret followed her steps slower, but no less determined. She sank to her knees beside them, her arms encompassing both the man and the boy. Mara, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to whine softly, her tail thumping rhythmically against the snow-covered planks. The puppies, Hazel and Bruno, darted between the humans, their tiny bodies shivering with an excitement they did not fully understand, but felt in every fiber of their being. After a long moment, the initial wave of shock subsided into a heavy, resonant quiet. Caleb pulled back slightly, his gaze moving from Margaret to Jimmy, and then down to the puppies that were now playfully nipping at his bootlaces. He looked at Mara, whose eyes were fixed on him with a devotion that transcended time and distance. The realization of what he had missed hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "I did not know," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking and hollow. "Margaret, I had no idea. When I left, when I was forced to leave her behind, I did not know she was carrying them. I thought I was only leaving one heart behind. I did not know I was leaving a whole family." His hands reached out to stroke Hazel's soft ears. The puppy leaned into his touch, her eyes closing in contentment. Caleb's chest heaved as he looked at the two small lives that had begun in his absence. He thought of the cold nights Mara must have endured, the fear she must have felt as her body changed, and he was nowhere to be found. He thought of Margaret and Jimmy, who had stepped into the void he had left, providing the warmth and safety he had failed to give. The weight of his debt to them felt immeasurable. He looked at Margaret, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness he was not sure he deserved. "You took care of them," he said, the words thick with emotion. "You took care of all of them. I owe you. I owe you everything." I left you with a burden, and you turned it into a family." Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing the hair away from his forehead just as she had when he was a younger man. "There are no debts here, Caleb," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears. "Mara was the one who kept us going. She gave Jimmy a reason to be brave, and she gave me a reason to keep the light on. We did not just take care of her. She took care of us." Jimmy looked up at Caleb, his face glowing with a newfound maturity. He had spent so long waiting for a father figure to return, and in the silence of that wait he had learned the true meaning of loyalty from the dogs. He reached out and placed a hand on Caleb's arm, his grip firm. "We knew you would come back," he said simply. "Mara told us every day." Caleb gathered the puppies into his lap, one under each arm, while Mara rested her heavy head on his knee. The circle was complete. The porch, which for so long had been a symbol of longing and the site of Mara's lonely vigil, was transformed. It was no longer a place defined by what was missing, but by what had been found. He looked out at the dark woods and the snow-covered fields, the world that had seemed so vast and indifferent just an hour ago. Now it felt small and manageable. He looked back at the house, the door still standing open, inviting them into the warmth. "I promise you," Caleb said, his voice ringing with a new strength, "this porch, it will not be for waiting anymore. No more looking at the road wondering if the gate will open. From now on, this is where we welcome the morning. This is where we watch these two grow up. This is where we stay." He stood up his legs, feeling stronger than they had in years. He helped Margaret to her feet, and together with Jimmy leading the way, and the three dogs trailing at their heels, they stepped across the threshold. As the door clicked shut behind them, the silence of the winter night returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was the peaceful silence of a home that was finally whole. Jimmy lingered for a second before the door closed, looking back at the spot where Mara had spent so many nights. He realized then that being a man was not about being big or strong, or going off to fight wars. It was about the quiet courage of staying, the fierce loyalty of waiting, and the strength to love even when the world felt empty. He smiled a secret knowing smile, and followed his family inside, ready to become the man the dogs already believed he was. The house was soon filled with the sounds of life, the clatter of bowls, the rustle of blankets, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of tired dogs. The long winter of their souls had finally broken, and though the snow still lay deep outside, the first breath of a permanent spring had arrived in the heart of the Turner home. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Caleb sat on the rug, his back against the sofa, with the dogs piled around him. He looked at Margaret and Jimmy, then at the sleeping puppies. He knew there would be hard days ahead, memories to process, and a life to rebuild. But as he felt Mara's steady heartbeat against his side, he knew he was no longer a ghost haunting his own past. He was home. The morning did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a symphony of gold and crystal. The sun climbed over the jagged peaks of the horizon, casting long amber fingers across the valley of Maple Hollow. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the light did not feel cold. It was a heavy, liquid warmth that seeped into the timber of the old Turner farmhouse, coaxing the frost to weep from the window panes. The rhythmic dripping of melting snow from the eaves created a steady, percussive heartbeat for the day. A sound of transition of the earth finally exhaling after a long, suffocating breath. Caleb Turner stood on the porch, his boots crunching into the softening slush. He breathed in deeply the air, no longer stinging his lungs with the sharpness of ice, but carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp pine and waking soil. His body still ached with the legacy of the North, the phantom pains in his joints, and the stiffness in his scarred hands. But as he watched the mist rise from the valley floor, he felt a lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the atmosphere. The ghost that had occupied his skin for years was finally fading, replaced by a man who was beginning to remember the weight of his own name. Beside him, Jimmy was already busy. The boy had hauled several planks of fresh cedar from the barn, the wood smelling of spice and resin. Today was not a day for resting. It was a day for building. They had decided the night before that the old cramped kennel would no longer suffice. Mara, the matriarch who had held their hope together, deserved a palace, and the two growing shadows, Hazel and Bruno, needed a place of their own. Jimmy handled the saw with a newfound maturity, his movements deliberate and focused. The boy who had spent months staring down the road in silent grief had transformed into a young man building a future with his own two hands. Caleb knelt beside his son, picking up a hammer. The weight of the tool felt right. For a long time, the only things he had held were a rifle and the cold railings of a transport ship. Now he held the means to create. As they worked together, the rhythmic strike of the hammer against the nails echoing through the quiet morning, Caleb began to speak. It wasn't the hesitant, broken speech of the previous night. It was a steady flow of memory, a purging of the shadows he had carried back from the frozen wastes of Alaska. He told Jimmy about the whiteout, the moments when the world turned into a featureless void of screaming wind and blinding snow, where a man could lose his mind in minutes if he didn't have a tether. He spoke of the silence of the tundra, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on the soul. He described the nights when the aurora borealis danced overhead in ribbons of emerald and violet, and how in the deepest part of his isolation, he would close his eyes and picture the specific way the light hit the kitchen table in Maple Hollow. He told him that the thought of Mara's wet nose against his hand was often the only thing that kept him from lying down in the snow and letting the sleep of the frost take him. Jimmy listened in silence, his hands never pausing, though his eyes occasionally shimmered with the intensity of the story. He realized then that his father hadn't just been gone. He had been fighting a war of the spirit. Every nail they drove into the cedar wood felt like a seal on those memories, a way of saying that the cold could no longer reach them. They were building more than a doghouse. They were building a fortress of normalcy. Margaret emerged from the house carrying a tray of steaming mugs. She stopped at the edge of the porch, her breath catching for a moment, as she watched the two most important men in her life working in tandem. The tension that had etched lines into her face over the last year seemed to have dissolved overnight. She looked at Caleb, truly looked at him, and saw that the hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, burning presence. She set the tray down and joined them, sitting on an upturned crate, content to simply exist in the radius of their shared labor. Nearby, the three dogs were enjoying the spoils of the season. Mara lay in a patch of direct sunlight, her dark coat soaking up the heat. She looked regal, her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed but always tracking the movement of Caleb and Jimmy. She was the anchor, the silent witness who had survived the long vigil. Beside her, the puppies were a whirlwind of chaotic energy. Hazel, the more adventurous of the two, had discovered Caleb's discarded work boot and was currently engaged in a fierce tug-of-war with it. Bruno, the larger and clumsier pup, was attempting to jump over a melting snowdrift, only to tumble headfirst into the slush, emerging with a confused but happy expression. Caleb paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked down at the puppies, then at Mara. A soft laugh escaped his lips, a sound that felt foreign yet wonderful. He reached out and ruffled Bruno's ears as the puppy bounded over to him, tail wagging with such force it shook his entire body. Caleb looked up at the sky, the blue so deep and clear it looked like a polished gemstone. He realized then that he had spent so long looking for a miracle in the big things, in his survival, in his return, in the grand gestures of fate. But as he watched Hazel finally vanquish his boot, and Mara let out a long, contented sigh, he understood that the real miracle was the persistence of the small things. It was the way a dog's loyalty never wavered, even when the world forgot your face. It was the way a son's love could bridge the gap of years of absence. It was the way the spring always followed the winter, no matter how harsh the frost had been. The miracle was the quiet strength of those who stayed, those who waited, and those who refused to let the fire go out. The doghouse was finished by noon. It was a sturdy structure built to last for generations of Turners and their companions. They lined the floor with soft hay and old blankets that smelled of home. Jimmy called the dogs over, and there was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy as the puppies explored their new domain, their small barks echoing inside the cedar walls. Mara approached last, sniffing the entrance with a discerning air before stepping inside and turning around 3 times, finally settling down with a grunt of approval. Caleb sat on the edge of the porch, his legs dangling over the side. Margaret sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. Jimmy sat on the other side, his arm draped over Bruno, who had finally exhausted himself and fallen asleep. They sat in a row, 4 souls, 5, 6, 7, bound together by a history of loss and a future of hope. The road that stretched away from the house was still there, but it no longer looked like a path of departure. It was simply a road, and they were the ones who lived at the end of it. Caleb looked at the gate, the one Mara had watched for so many nights. He felt a profound sense of closure. The waiting was over. The porch was no longer a lookout tower. It was a sanctuary. He thought about the words he had whispered to Mara in the dark of the previous night, and he realized they were the only truth that mattered. Loyalty wasn't a choice. It was a state of being. It was the silent vow that said, "I will be here when the world turns cold, and I will be here when the sun returns." The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of violet and rose. The shadows grew long again, but they were no longer threatening. They were merely the gentle closing of a day well spent. As the first stars began to twinkle in the cooling air, Caleb felt a deep, resonant peace settle into his bones. He was no longer the man who had been lost in the ice. He was the man who had been found by the love of a dog and the resilience of a family. The world might forget the names of the soldiers and the details of the storms, but the heart remembers the way home. Loyalty is a vow that requires no words, and love is the only compass that can guide a soul through the longest winter. As the door to the Turner home clicked shut for the night, the silence of Maple Hollow was no longer empty. It was full of the breathing of the living, the dreams of the loyal, and the enduring warmth of a home that was finally irrevocably whole. The 4 figures on the porch remained etched in the golden hour, a testament to the fact that no matter how far one wanders, the light of home never truly goes out, as long as there is someone or something waiting to keep the flame alive. The long night of the Turner family had ended, and the dawn they had earned was just beginning.